December 18th, 1944. The twin villages of Krinkelt-Rocherath, Belgium. Through the morning mist, 600 American soldiers watched as 48 German Panzers rolled toward their positions. Panthers, Tigers, Panzer IVs. The finest armor the Wehrmacht could muster, backed by thousands of SS troops from the elite 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. Every tactical manual said the same thing. When facing superior armor in an urban environment, you withdraw to open ground where you can maneuver. You don't let tanks trap you in narrow streets. You don't let yourself be surrounded. Captain Charles MacDonald looked at his men from Company 1, 23rd Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division, scattered among the stone houses and narrow lanes. They were low on ammunition. They had no tanks of their own nearby. The Panthers were already entering the southern edge of Rocherath. MacDonald made a decision that defied conventional armor doctrine. He ordered his men to hold their positions. Let the Panzers come deeper into the village. Let them enter streets barely wide enough for their hulls. Let them think they had already won. Through the grey December dawn, German tank commanders watched the stone church tower at the centre of the twin villages, believing they were about to crush the last organised American resistance on the northern shoulder of Hitler's Great Ardennes offensive. They had no idea they were driving into a killing ground where American infantry would transform narrow Belgian streets into a graveyard for German armour that would claim 48 tanks in 72 hours. The mathematics of armour warfare had always favoured the attacker in open terrain. But MacDonald and his battalion had learned something in 4 days of desperate fighting that no training manual could teach. In confined streets, a 30-ton Panther became a steel coffin, and 600 infantrymen with bazookas could stop what looked like an unstoppable armoured tide. The fog that morning was thick enough to touch, reducing visibility to perhaps 20 yards in the narrow streets between Krinkelt and Rocherath's stone houses. For the German tank commanders of the 12th SS Panzer Division, the limited visibility was both advantage and curse. It concealed their approach from American artillery observers, but it also meant they couldn't see what waited around each corner in the maze of streets ahead. Willy Fischer commanded a Panther tank in the lead element of the assault. His tank, like all Panthers, was a masterpiece of German engineering. 75mm high-velocity gun, frontal armour up to 80mm thick, capable of destroying any American Sherman at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. The Panther represented everything the Wehrmacht believed about modern warfare. Technological superiority translated directly into battlefield dominance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Fischer's company had fought across France during the summer. They understood how American forces typically deployed their armour, usually in combined arms teams with infantry support, engaging at medium to long range, where the Panthers' superior optics and firepower gave German crews decisive advantages. The Americans, Fischer had been told repeatedly during briefings, lacked the stomach for close-quarters tank fighting. They preferred to engage from distance, using their numerical superiority rather than tactical skill. The battle for Krinkelt-Rocherath had begun 4 days earlier, when German forces launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the Belgian port of Antwerp. The 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, had been given the most direct route to the Meuse River and beyond. But that route passed directly through a low ridge line called Elsenborn Ridge, and the only roads to that ridge ran through the twin villages where MacDonald's men now waited. The 2nd Infantry Division had been attacking eastward into Germany when the German offensive struck on December 16th. General Walter Robertson, commanding the division, faced an immediate crisis. His forward battalions were miles ahead of their supply lines, scattered across difficult terrain, with German forces suddenly flooding through gaps in American lines to the south. Any conventional retreat would have been a disaster, exposing his troops to flanking attacks and potential encirclement. Robertson instead ordered what military historians would later call one of the most complex tactical withdrawals of the war. His forward units would pull back through reserve battalions in a series of carefully coordinated bounds, each unit covering the withdrawal of the next. The maneuver required split-second timing, disciplined fire control, and absolute faith that each battalion would hold its assigned positions long enough for the others to escape. Private William Soderman had joined Company K, 9th Infantry Regiment, just 3 months earlier. At 23 years old, he represented the new generation of American soldiers flooding into Europe after D-Day. His weapons training emphasized the M1 bazooka, a tube-launched rocket that could penetrate up to 4 inches of armor at ranges under 300 yards. The training manuals warned repeatedly about the bazooka's limitations against German heavy armor. Against a Panther's frontal armor, the weapon was almost useless. Only side and rear shots offered any hope of penetration. Soderman had already learned that reality bore little resemblance to training scenarios. 2 days earlier, during the initial German assault, he had watched Panthers shrug off multiple bazooka hits to their frontal armor before continuing their advance. The tanks seemed invincible, mechanical, and monsters that crushed American positions through sheer armored mass. But he had also observed something the training manuals never mentioned. In confined terrain, Panthers moved slowly, their commanders reluctant to expose their flanks. And when they stopped to engage a target, they became temporarily stationary, vulnerable to the patient rifleman who could work his way to point-blank range. The twin villages themselves represented everything that made the Ardennes such difficult tank country. Krinkelt and Rocherath had grown together over centuries, their stone houses built shoulder to shoulder along narrow lanes that predated wheeled vehicles. Main streets barely accommodated a single Panther, forcing tank commanders to navigate with extreme care. Side alleys were too narrow for armor entirely. Courtyards and gardens created dead zones where infantry could hide while tanks passed. Most critically, the villages sat at a key road junction. Every major route from the German border to Elsenborn Ridge passed through or immediately adjacent to Krinkelt-Rocherath. The Germans could not simply bypass the villages. They needed to control this ground to secure their supply lines and protect the flanks of their advance units. And the Americans understood that every hour they held these villages bought time for other units to organize defensive positions on Elsenborn Ridge itself. Captain MacDonald had positioned his company with the careful precision of a chess master setting up an endgame. Machine gun positions covered the main approaches, pre-registered to deliver interlocking fires across every street wide enough for armor. Bazooka teams waited in upper-story windows and behind garden walls, positioned to engage tank flanks as they passed. Rifle squads occupied buildings at key intersections, ready to pin down German infantry while the armor-killer teams did their work. The tactic MacDonald was about to implement had no official name in American doctrine. German. Military manuals might have called it Nahkampf, close combat. The Russians on the Eastern Front called it tank hunting. Whatever the terminology, the principle was simple and terrifying. When you lack the firepower to stop enemy armor at range, you let the armor come to you. You draw it into terrain where its advantages become liabilities. And then you kill it at point-blank range with weapons designed for close-quarters work. First Lieutenant Stephen Tupner commanded Company K, which held the northern section of Rocherath. His men had been fighting continuously since December 16th, falling back from the German border through a series of increasingly desperate defensive positions. They were exhausted, running low on ammunition, facing an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited reserves of men and armor. But Tupner understood something that German planners had not anticipated. American infantry doctrine emphasized individual initiative and small unit tactics to a degree that German forces, with their emphasis on centralized command and coordinated maneuver, could not match. Every American rifleman was trained to think tactically, to identify targets of opportunity, to adapt to changing circumstances without waiting for orders. In the chaos of close-quarters combat, where company and battalion commanders lost contact with their forward elements, that training became decisive. The German assault plan for December 18th relied on combined arms coordination. Panthers and Panzer IVs would advance through the village streets, suppressing American defensive positions with high explosive rounds. SS Panzer Grenadiers would follow behind the armour, clearing buildings and eliminating infantry positions. Artillery and Nebelwerfer rocket batteries would saturate suspected American positions with indirect fire. The plan assumed that American forces, already battered by 4 days of fighting, would collapse under this concentrated assault. What the plan failed to account for was the nature of combat in confined urban terrain. Artillery became less effective when both sides occupied the same streets. Combined arms coordination broke down when visibility dropped below 50 yards, and armour, separated from its infantry support, became vulnerable to the very weapons it was designed to dominate. As dawn broke on December 18th, the temperature hovered just below freezing. Ice covered the cobblestone streets, making footing treacherous for infantry and creating traction problems for tanks. The fog that had settled overnight showed no signs of lifting, reducing the engagement range to knife-fighting distance. For the Americans scattered through the twin villages, the weather represented an unexpected gift. German artillery observers couldn't see targets. Panther gunners couldn't engage at the ranges where their superior optics gave them advantage, and bazooka teams could approach tanks without being spotted until they were close enough to guarantee a killing shot. Sergeant José López manned a machine gun position at the intersection of two main streets in Rocherath. The weapon was a Browning M1919-4, an air-cooled 30-caliber machine gun capable of sustained fire at rates exceeding 400 rounds per minute. López had been fighting since the first German artillery barrage on December 16th. His position had been overrun twice, forcing him to withdraw and establish new defensive positions further west. But each time, he had taken his machine gun with him, refusing to abandon the weapon that had become his primary means of keeping German infantry at bay. The tactical situation facing the Americans in Krinkelt-Rocherath was unprecedented in the European campaign. Never before had American infantry been asked to hold urban terrain against massed armour attacks for multiple days. The fighting in Normandy had been primarily in bocage country, where hedgerows and narrow lanes created natural choke points. But the Ardennes was different. The Germans possessed both the armour to exploit breakthrough and the veteran infantry to consolidate gains. American forces were stretched thin across a wide front, with limited reserves and questionable supply lines. Yet the twin villages offered certain advantages that training manuals had not adequately addressed. Stone construction meant that buildings could withstand considerable punishment before collapsing. Narrow streets created natural ambush positions. Multiple exit routes allowed defending forces to withdraw from threatened positions while maintaining overall defensive coherence. And most importantly, the terrain negated German advantages in long-range gunnery and armoured mobility. The 644th Tank Destroyer Battalion had arrived in Krinkelt-Rocherath on December 17th with 3 M10 tank destroyers. The M10 was essentially a Sherman tank chassis fitted with a more powerful 3-inch gun and open-topped turret. While vulnerable to German counterfire, the M10's gun could penetrate Panther side armour at reasonable ranges. The tank destroyer crews understood they could not engage Panthers frontally without facing almost certain destruction. Instead, they positioned their vehicles at key intersections, where they could engage German armour from the flank as it attempted to navigate the narrow streets. Private First Class Richard Cowan occupied a machine gun position in the southern section of Krinkelt. He had watched German armour probe American positions repeatedly over the past 2 days, each time withdrawing after taking fire. But this morning felt different. The German assault was heavier, more coordinated, more determined. Cowan could hear the distinctive sound of Panther engines growing louder, accompanied by the shouted commands of German infantry moving forward. The attack that was about to begin would either break the American defense or prove that technological superiority meant nothing in terrain that favored the desperate defender. Through the morning, fog, the lead Panthers entered the streets of Rocherath. Their commanders, viewing the approach through periscopes and vision blocks, could see only the outlines of stone houses and the occasional movement of American infantry withdrawing before them. The SS troops following behind the armour were confident, veterans of battles across the Eastern Front who had learned to trust in their panzers' invincibility. What they could not see were the bazooka teams waiting in upper-story windows. The M10 tank destroyers, positioned in concealed firing positions at key intersections. The mines and daisy chains of explosives that American engineers had placed in the narrow streets during the pre-dawn hours. And the hundreds of American riflemen who had been ordered to hold their positions and let the panzers come to them, no matter how terrifying the sight of German armour grinding through the morning mist. Captain MacDonald watched the first Panther reach the main intersection in Rocherath. The tank, commander's head was visible in the cupola, scanning for threats. For a moment, everything seemed suspended, as if both sides were holding their breath before the violence resumed. Then, MacDonald gave the order that would transform a tactical withdrawal into one of the most devastating ambushes in the history of armoured warfare. All positions. This is Company 1. Execute tank hunting procedures. I say again, execute tank hunting procedures. Out. The response was not a storm of fire. Instead, the American positions maintained discipline, allowing the lead Panther to advance deeper into the intersection while bazooka teams manoeuvred into position. The tank's commander, still scanning for threats, had no idea that 6 American soldiers with rocket launchers were approaching from 3 different directions, each moving through buildings and gardens to establish firing positions less than 30 yards from his vehicle. The Panther's frontal armour was essentially invulnerable to the M1 bazooka, but its side armour was a different matter, and when a 45-ton tank entered an intersection barely wide enough to accommodate its hull, it couldn't manoeuvre quickly. The German commander was trapped by the very terrain he had thought to dominate, unable to reverse course, unable to traverse his turret fast enough to engage multiple threats simultaneously. Private Soderman fired first, his rocket striking the Panther's left track at a range of less than 25 yards. The explosion didn't penetrate the armour, but it immobilized the tank, leaving it blocking the intersection. A second bazooka team fired almost simultaneously, their rocket impacting the rear engine compartment where armour was thinner. This time the penetration was clean, and within seconds, smoke began pouring from the Panther's engine grills. The tank's crew had perhaps 30 seconds to evacuate before ammunition cooked off from the engine fire. But the surrounding buildings were filled with American riflemen who opened fire the moment the hatches cracked open. The tactical equation was brutal and simple. German tank crews could stay inside their vehicles and burn, or they could abandon the tanks and face rifle fire from point-blank range. Either way, the panzers that had seemed invincible hours earlier were being systematically destroyed in streets too narrow for effective manoeuvre. Willy Fischer, commanding a Panther 3 positions back in the column, watched his company commander's tank brew up at the intersection ahead. Through his periscope, he could see American infantry moving between buildings, but in the fog and smoke, he couldn't identify specific targets. His gunner was shouting for permission to fire, but Fischer hesitated. The high explosive rounds in his ready rack would certainly damage the stone buildings around them. But would they kill enough American infantry to make the advance viable? Or would he simply announce his position to every bazooka team, and within 3 blocks? The decision was made for him when an M10 tank destroyer emerged from a side street, its 3-inch gun already traversing to engage Fischer's Panther from less than 100 yards. At that range, against side armour, the M10's gun was lethal. Fischer's driver threw the Panther into reverse, trying desperately to back out of the killing zone before the tank destroyer could fire. But the narrow street offered no room to manoeuvre, and the icy cobblestones provided minimal traction. The Panther slid sideways, its track grinding against a stone wall, leaving its flank exposed. The M10's 3-inch gun spoke once. The armour-piercing round struck Fischer's Panther just below the turret ring, penetrating the side armour and detonating inside the fighting compartment. The explosion killed the loader instantly and wounded Fischer's gunner. Smoke and flame filled the interior as ammunition began cooking off. Fisher and his driver managed to escape through the commander's hatch, but 3 other crew members died inside the burning tank. By 08:30 on December 18th, 9 Panthers and Panzer IVs sat burning in the streets of Rocherath. The German assault, which had begun with such confidence 2 hours earlier, had stalled completely. SS Panzer Grenadiers, separated from their armoured support, were pinned down by American machine gun fire. Tank commanders who had survived the initial ambush were now refusing to advance further into what one would later describe as a deadly trap for the Panzers. But the battle was far from over. SS Gruppenführer Hermann Priess, commanding the 1st SS Panzer Corps, understood that Krinkelt-Rocherath represented the key to the entire northern offensive. Without control of these villages, German supply lines would remain exposed and vulnerable. He ordered the 12th SS Panzer Division to commit additional forces, regardless of casualties. The attack would continue. Private Soderman had expended all 6 rockets in his basic ammunition load. He scavenged additional rounds from wounded soldiers and disabled American positions, accumulating 8 more rockets by mid-morning. His actions during the early morning ambush had already destroyed or disabled 3 German tanks, but the cost was becoming apparent. Soderman had taken shrapnel wounds to both legs and his left shoulder. Each time he moved to engage another target, the pain grew worse. Yet he continued fighting, understanding that every tank disabled represented dozens of American lives saved. The German response to the morning's disaster revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Wehrmacht tactical doctrine. Rather than adapting their approach to account for the unique challenges of urban tank fighting, German commanders doubled down on their original strategy. More armour would be committed, more artillery would be fired, more SS infantry would be thrown into the assault. The assumption remained unchanged. Sufficient application of force would eventually overwhelm American resistance. What this approach failed to recognize was that American defensive tactics were specifically designed to exploit German predictability. Captain MacDonald and his fellow company commanders had studied German armor doctrine extensively. They understood that panzer units relied heavily on combined arms coordination and centralized command. Break that coordination, disrupt that command structure, and even elite SS formations became vulnerable to well-positioned defenders fighting on terrain of their choosing. The stone church at the center of the twin villages had become a key observation post for American forward observers directing artillery fire. From the bell tower, observers could see German forces massing for renewed assaults, could direct counter-battery fire against German artillery positions, and could call in concentrations against SS infantry, attempting to infiltrate American positions. The church's stone construction provided a protection against everything except direct hits from heavy artillery. Lieutenant Tupner's Company K had been fighting continuously for 6 hours when the second major German assault began around 1100 hours. This attack was better coordinated than the morning effort. German artillery plastered American positions with high explosive and white phosphorus rounds. Nebelwerfer batteries fired rocket salvos that created terrifying noise and psychological pressure even when they caused minimal physical damage. And most significantly, the Panthers advancing into Krinkelt this time were supported by dismounted Panzer Grenadiers who moved through gardens and side alleys, attempting to suppress American bazooka teams before they could engage the armor. The tactical evolution was significant. German commanders had learned from the morning's disaster and were adapting their approach. But they were adapting within the framework of conventional combined arms doctrine. What they still and failed to grasp was that American defenders were willing to call artillery fire directly onto their own positions, to fight Germans at bayonet range inside contested buildings, to sacrifice individual fighting positions, if doing so disrupted the larger German assault. Sergeant Lopez's machine gun had fired more than 4,000 rounds since the battle began. The barrel was dangerously overheated despite the freezing temperatures, and Lopez was running critically low on ammunition. When a group of SS Panzer Grenadiers attempted to rush his position, he continued firing even as German return fire shattered the windows around him and filled the room with dust and debris. The machine guns' sustained fire cut down the leading Germans and forced the survivors to seek cover, buying enough time for other American positions to reinforce the threatened sector. The cost of such heroism was predictable. Lopez took multiple wounds from grenade fragments and rifle fire, but he refused evacuation, instead directing other soldiers to bring him additional ammunition and water to cool his overheated machine gun barrel. His actions would later earn him the Medal of Honor, but in the moment, he was simply doing what hundreds of other American soldiers were doing throughout Krinkelt-Rocherath, fighting with a desperate intensity that German commanders had not believed Americans capable of sustaining. By noon, the Germans had succeeded in pushing American forces out of the southern section of Rocherath. 5 Panthers had managed to reach the main intersection near the church, a significant penetration that threatened to split the American defense. SS infantry followed the armor, occupying buildings that American forces had held just hours earlier. For a brief moment, it appeared the German assault might succeed in breaking through to Elsenborn Ridge. Captain MacDonald, observing the German penetration from his command post, made a decision that would have seemed insane to conventional military thinking. Rather than ordering a withdrawal to preserve his remaining forces, he called for artillery fire directly on the intersection where German armor was concentrating. The coordinates he provided were less than 200 yards from his own position, close enough that American troops could feel the concussion from each impact. Close enough that shrapnel from the barrage wounded several of MacDonald's own men, but the artillery fire achieved its intended purpose. The Panthers, unable to maneuver in the confined intersection and taking direct hits from 105mm howitzer rounds, were disabled or destroyed. The SS infantry, caught in the open by the American barrage, took catastrophic casualties, and most importantly, the German penetration was stopped before it could be exploited and expanded into a genuine breakthrough. The Americans defending Krinkelt-Rocherath were implementing what would later be called defense in depth, though that term inadequately captures the desperation and improvisation that characterized their tactics. They established multiple defensive lines through the villages, each one prepared to delay German advances while forces further back organized counterattacks or called in artillery support. When a position became untenable, defenders withdrew to the next prepared line rather than fighting to the death in place. This flexibility, combined with the willingness to take risks that German doctrine would never permit, created a defensive system that was simultaneously rigid and fluid. Rigid in the sense that key positions like the church and main intersections were held at all costs. Fluid in the sense that individual squads and platoons constantly repositioned to meet emerging threats, often without orders from higher command. Private First Class Richard Cowan's machine gun position in southern Krinkelt had been overrun twice during the midday German assault. Each time, Cowan had withdrawn with his weapon to a new position, established fields of fire, and resumed engaging German infantry attempting to advance behind their armour. By mid-afternoon, he had expended more than 3,000 rounds and was operating on his third machine gun barrel after the previous 2 had become unusable due to overheating. The German tactical problem was becoming increasingly apparent to observers on both sides. Every Panther destroyed in Krinkelt-Rocherath represented an irreplaceable loss to the offensive. German tank production in late 1944 could not keep pace with battlefield attrition, and the Panthers burning in Belgian streets were desperately needed elsewhere along the front. Yet SS commanders continued feeding armour into the engagement, driven by Hitler's personal orders to capture Elsenborn Ridge, regardless of cost. By 1500 hours, German forces had committed elements of 3 separate panzer regiments to the assault on Krinkelt-Rocherath. Intelligence estimates suggested more than 70 German tanks had been involved in the fighting since dawn. Of these, American defenders had destroyed or disabled 48. The exchange ratio was staggering. Against German armour losses, American casualties numbered approximately 100 killed and wounded. The mathematics of attrition warfare were operating in reverse, with defenders inflicting losses that attackers could not sustain. The 741st Tank Battalion, which had been supporting the 2nd Infantry Division throughout the battle, finally received a small number of M4 Sherman tanks to replace losses from earlier fighting. Though outmatched by Panthers in terms of armour and firepower, the Shermans provided desperately needed mobile firepower. Tank commanders quickly learned to use the same ambush tactics that infantry had been employing. Let German armour advance into confined terrain, then engage from the flank at close range, where even the Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate Panther side armour. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The afternoon fighting took on a character distinct from the morning's battle. German forces, having learned that frontal assaults into urban terrain were suicidal, began attempting to bypass Krinkelt-Rocherath entirely. Panzer columns probed south and north, seeking routes around the twin villages that would allow them to continue their advance toward the Meuse. But American forces had established blocking positions on every approach, and the terrain outside the villages was heavily mined. Each German attempt to find an alternate route was detected, engaged with artillery, and forced back. What German commanders were slowly, painfully realizing was that the American defense of Krinkelt-Rocherath had never been primarily about holding two small Belgian villages. It was about buying time. Every hour that German armour spent fighting in the twin villages was an hour that other American units used to strengthen positions on Elsenborn Ridge. Every tank destroyed in the narrow streets was one less Panther available for the breakthrough that German operational plans required. The tactical battle was being won by the Americans even as individual positions changed hands repeatedly. Lieutenant Tupner's Company K had been reduced to fewer than 50 effective soldiers by mid-afternoon. The company had started the battle with more than 180 men 4 days earlier. Casualties had been relentless. Killed, wounded, missing, separated from their units in the chaos of combat. Yet Tupner refused to request permission to withdraw. His position in northern Rocherath anchored the entire American defensive line. If Company K broke, the entire structure of the defense would collapse. The psychological pressure on American defenders was immense. They were outnumbered, outgunned, fighting an enemy renowned for military prowess. German artillery fire was constant, and the sound of Panther engines growling through the fog created a sense of impending doom that no amount of training could fully prepare soldiers to handle. Yet the Americans held. They held because their officers led from the front. They held because they trusted in their training and their weapons. And they held because they could see, with their own eyes, that their tactics were working. Panthers that should have been invincible were burning. SS infantry that should have been unstoppable were pinned down or retreating. By 1600 hours, SS Gruppenführer Priess faced a decision that would define the remainder of the northern offensive. His forces had been fighting for Krinkelt-Rocherath for 4 days, taking catastrophic casualties without achieving breakthrough. Kampfgruppe Paper, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, had already bypassed the twin villages to the south and was driving toward the Meuse. But Piper's flanks were dangerously exposed, and his supply lines were tenuous at best. Without control of Krinkelt-Rocherath, the entire northern offensive remained vulnerable to American counterattacks. Priess ordered one final, all-out assault for the evening of December 18th. Every available tank would be committed. Every SS infantry battalion would attack simultaneously. Artillery and Nebelwerfer batteries would fire their remaining ammunition in a sustained barrage designed to break American morale. The assault would either capture the twin villages or exhaust German offensive capability in the sector. There would be no middle ground. American defenders, monitoring German radio communications and observing the build-up of forces, understood what was coming. The final German assault would either break through or fail decisively. There were no reserves to commit, no fallback positions prepared. Captain MacDonald and his fellow commanders made the only decision available to them. They would hold their positions and trust that American firepower, properly employed, would break the German attack. As darkness fell on December 18th, the temperature dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice covered every surface, making movement treacherous for infantry and nearly impossible for tanks. The fog that had characterized the morning fighting returned, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. Under these conditions, the final German assault began with an artillery barrage that exceeded anything American defenders had experienced during the entire battle. High explosive rounds crashed into American positions with metronomic regularity. White phosphorus created burning clouds that set buildings aflame and forced defenders to evacuate positions they had held all day. Nebelwerfer rockets shrieked through the darkness, their psychological impact almost as devastating as their explosive force. For 30 minutes, the barrage continued, pulverizing American defensive positions and creating the impression that nothing could survive such concentrated firepower. Then, the German armour advanced. Panthers and Panzer IVs, their hulls barely visible in the darkness and fog, ground forward through the rubble-strewn streets. SS Panzer Grenadiers followed close behind, their white winter camouflage making them nearly invisible against the snow-covered ground. The assault had all the hallmarks of German military excellence: coordination, determination, overwhelming force applied at the decisive point. But the Americans were still there. In cellars and upper-story rooms, behind rubble piles and in partially collapsed buildings, the defenders who had somehow survived the barrage took up their weapons and prepared to fight once more. Sergeant Lopez, despite multiple wounds, returned to his machine gun. Private Soderman, barely able to walk, positioned himself at a basement window with his bazooka. Lieutenant Tupner, who had been calling artillery fire throughout the barrage, continued directing his company's defence even as German infantry advanced to within grenade range of his command post. The final German assault shattered against American positions like a wave breaking on rocks. Bazooka teams engaged Panthers at ranges measured in yards. Machine guns fired until their barrels glowed red in the darkness. Riflemen fought SS troops hand-to-hand in the ruins of buildings that had changed hands multiple times throughout the day. The violence was primal, desperate, beyond anything that training or doctrine could adequately prepare men to face. By 2100 hours, the German assault had exhausted itself. 16 more Panthers sat burning or disabled in the streets of Krinkelt-Rocherath. SS infantry casualties exceeded 500 killed and wounded. And critically, German offensive capability in the northern sector had been broken. There would be no breakthrough to Elsenborn Ridge, no dash to the Meuse, no encirclement of American forces. SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, received reports of the failure with stunned disbelief. His best divisions, equipped with the finest armour Germany could produce, had been stopped by American infantry defending 2 insignificant Belgian villages. The mathematical reality was undeniable. German forces had lost 48 tanks in 3 days of fighting for terrain that possessed no intrinsic strategic value. The only significance of Krinkelt-Rocherath was that American forces had chosen to defend it, and in defending it, had destroyed the northern prong of Hitler's last offensive in the west. During the night of December 18th–19th, American forces began their final withdrawal from Krinkelt-Rocherath. The movement was conducted with the same disciplined precision that had characterized the entire defense. Rearguard elements maintained positions in the twin villages, while the main force withdrew to prepared positions on Elsenborn Ridge. German forces, exhausted and demoralized by 3 days of catastrophic losses, made no serious attempt to interfere with the American withdrawal. By dawn on December 19th, German forces finally occupied Krinkelt-Rocherath. They found a devastated landscape of burned-out buildings, destroyed tanks, and American equipment abandoned during the withdrawal. But they also found that the tactical situation remained unchanged. American forces now occupied Elsenborn Ridge in strength, backed by massed artillery and with clear fields of observation across the approaches. The northern route to the Meuse was closed. Private Soderman was evacuated on December 19th, his wounds finally too severe to continue fighting. He had destroyed or disabled a confirmed total of 3 Panthers during the battle, with several other probable kills. His actions would earn him the Medal of Honor, though he would spend months in hospitals recovering from his wounds. Sergeant Lopez survived the battle, though his wounds would eventually require evacuation as well. Lieutenant Tupner was never seen again after calling artillery fire directly on his own position during a final German assault. His body was never recovered, and he was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The Battle of Krinkelt-Rocherath had lasted 4 days, from December 16th through December 19th, 1944. In that time, approximately 600 American soldiers from the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions had held 2 small Belgian villages against repeated assaults by elements of 3 SS Panzer Divisions. The cost to both sides was severe. American casualties exceeded 400 killed, wounded, and missing. German losses were even more catastrophic: 48 tanks destroyed or disabled, more than 800 SS infantry killed or wounded, and most significantly, the complete failure of the northern offensive. The tactical lessons of Krinkelt-Rocherath would influence American defensive doctrine for the remainder of the war and beyond. The battle demonstrated that well-trained infantry, fighting on terrain that negated enemy advantages in armor and firepower, could achieve results that conventional military wisdom considered impossible. It proved that American soldiers, when properly led and equipped, could match the combat effectiveness of Germany's most elite formations. And it showed that technological superiority meant nothing when attacking forces were drawn into terrain where defenders possessed every advantage. But perhaps the most significant lesson was psychological rather than tactical. The German High Command had believed that American forces lacked the will to sustain heavy casualties in defensive fighting. They believed that sufficient application of force would inevitably break American resistance. The defense of Krinkelt-Rocherath proved both assumptions catastrophically wrong. American soldiers had fought with a determination and tactical sophistication that German commanders found difficult to credit, even after experiencing it firsthand. For the 6th SS Panzer Army, the failure at Krinkelt-Rocherath marked the effective end of offensive capability in the northern Ardennes. The tanks destroyed in the twin villages' narrow streets could not be replaced. The SS infantry casualties could not be made good. And most critically, the time lost fighting for 2 small Belgian villages had allowed American forces to organize defensive positions that would prove impregnable for the remainder of the battle. Hitler would order continued attacks against Elsenborn Ridge throughout late December, but none achieved anything beyond adding to German casualty lists. By December 23rd, the Führer finally acknowledged reality and ordered SS Panzer divisions redirected south to support the 5th Panzer Army's assault toward Bastogne. But by then, the moment for exploitation had passed. American reinforcements were flooding into the Pocantu, Ardennes. Weather had cleared, allowing Allied air power to devastate German supply columns. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month, but its outcome had been determined in large part by 600 American soldiers who held 2 Belgian villages against the finest armor Germany could deploy. The mathematics of the engagement told the story with brutal clarity. 48 German tanks destroyed, 21 knocked out by infantry bazooka teams, 27 destroyed by towed anti-tank guns, tank destroyers, artillery, and mines. Against these losses, American defenders had suffered approximately 400 casualties across 4 days of continuous combat. The exchange ratio was unprecedented in the history of armored warfare. More than 1 German tank destroyed for every 10 American casualties. In open terrain, with room to maneuver and employ their superior range and firepower, those same Panthers might have inflicted 10 times the casualties they actually suffered. But Captain MacDonald and his fellow commanders had understood something fundamental about modern warfare that German doctrine had failed to grasp. Technological superiority was contextual, not absolute. The finest tank in the world became a liability when forced to navigate streets barely wide enough for its hull. The most elite infantry in Europe could be stopped by determined defenders fighting from prepared positions in urban terrain. And numerical superiority meant nothing when attacking forces could only advance through killing zones that negated their advantages in numbers and firepower. The aftermath of Krinkelt-Rocherath would haunt German military planning for the remainder of the war. The loss of 48 tanks in 3 days represented a rate of attrition that no industrial economy could sustain indefinitely. More significantly, the battle revealed fundamental flaws in German combined arms doctrine that had been masked by earlier victories against less capable opponents. American forces had proven they could fight and win even when outnumbered, outgunned, and facing Germany's most elite formations. For the American soldiers who survived Krinkelt-Rocherath, the battle became a defining experience that shaped how they viewed both themselves and their enemy. They had faced the Wehrmacht's best and discovered that superior tactics, properly executed, could overcome technological and numerical disadvantages. The confidence gained from that experience would characterize American operations for the remainder of the European campaign, from the Ardennes through the final battles in Germany itself. The twin villages themselves were largely destroyed during the fighting. Stone houses that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. The church tower that had served as an American observation post was heavily damaged by German artillery. Streets were cratered by tank fire and littered with destroyed vehicles from both sides. Belgian civilians, who had been evacuated before the fighting began, would return weeks later to find their homes destroyed and their villages transformed into monuments to modern warfare's destructive capacity. Today, Krinkelt and Rocherath have been rebuilt, their streets restored, their houses reconstructed. But memorials throughout the twin villages remember the battle that transformed 2 small Belgian communities into names that would be studied by military historians for generations. The stone church, rebuilt after the war, contains plaques commemorating the American soldiers who defended the villages during those desperate December days in 1944. The lesson of Krinkelt-Rocherath remains relevant for understanding how conventional military advantages can be negated by superior tactics and determination. 600 American soldiers had faced an armored assault that should have overwhelmed their positions in hours. Instead, they held for 4 days, destroying nearly 50 enemy tanks and breaking the offensive capability of an entire German army. They accomplished this not through technological superiority or numerical advantage, but through tactical innovation, individual courage, and the willingness to fight in terrain where their weapons could be employed most effectively. The Panthers that burned in Krinkelt-Rocherath's narrow streets represented more than tactical losses. They symbolized the failure of a military doctrine that prioritized technological solutions over tactical adaptation. German commanders had believed that sufficient armor, properly supported, could overcome any defensive position. American defenders proved that belief catastrophically wrong. In doing so, they wrote one of the most significant chapters in the history of armored warfare, a chapter that demonstrated how determination, tactical skill, and proper use of terrain could defeat even the most advanced weapons systems of the era. As winter darkness fell on December 19th, and American forces completed their withdrawal to Elsenborn Ridge, German commanders surveyed the cost of their Pyrrhic victory. They had captured 2 destroyed Belgian villages. They had lost 48 irreplaceable tanks. They had suffered more than 800 infantry casualties. And they had failed to achieve the breakthrough that the entire northern offensive had been designed to accomplish. The Americans had retreated, but they had retreated to stronger positions after exacting a price that the Wehrmacht could not afford to pay. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.